Loup River Flat, Nebraska, August 1884. The sun was a hammer, beating the prairie into a shimmering anvil of heat. Dust devils danced in the distance, twisting columns of topsoil and dried grass into the brassy sky. In this immense, baked emptiness, Balint Komlos was building something foolish. He stood barefoot in a shallow pit of his own making, the dark, wet clay sucking at his ankles. With a rhythmic, plodding motion, he worked, trampling water and chopped prairie grass into the heavy earth, his body a human pestle in a crude mortar. A few yards away stood the core of his house, a small, tight rectangle of cottonwood logs, looking ordinary enough. But now he was methodically plastering his foul-smelling concoction onto the outside of it, lift by muddy lift. A pair of riders reined in their horses, their shadows stretching long and sharp across the parched ground. The lead rider, Asa Renfrew, was the local timber broker, a man whose opinion on what constituted a proper building carried the weight of commerce. He sat his saddle with an air of bemused authority, a slight smirk playing on his lips. His companion, a farmer named Silas Croft, simply stared, his mouth agape. "What in God's name is that, Komlos?" Renfrew called out, his voice laced with the easy confidence of a man who knows he is right. "Decided your logs needed a mud bath?" Balint paused, wiping a forearm across his sweaty brow, leaving a streak of brown clay. He looked at the half-finished wall, a sloping, lumpy mass of earth that already rose 4 feet from the ground. "It is a wall," he said, his English thick with the cadence of his native Hungary. "That's not a wall. That's a termite's paradise," Renfrew scoffed, turning to Croft. "Looks like he's building a giant hornet's nest, the mad Magyar of the Loop." Silas Croft chuckled nervously. "It's a damned odd thing, Asa. Never seen the like." Another neighbor, Jebediah Finch, had wandered over from his claim, drawn by the spectacle. "He's been at it for weeks," Finch offered. "Mixing mud and grass like he's baking some devil's cake. It's the most foolish piece of building I've ever laid eyes on." Renfrew shook his head, the smirk hardening into a look of pity. "He'll learn. Come the first hard frost, that whole foolish mess will slump into a puddle, and he'll have wasted a perfectly good cabin core inside it." He spurred his horse, riding off without a backward glance. The laughter of the men carried on the hot, dry wind. Balint Komlos did not watch them go. He simply bent his back, scooped up another heavy handful of the wet clay, and returned to his work. What did this Hungarian Volyog-Vedo, this puddled clay razor, understand about thermal mass storage that the most experienced timbermen on the Nebraska plains had missed? I promise you, the answer to that question is not just a piece of history. It's a lesson in physics that is as true today as it was in 1884. Stay with me, and you'll learn a principle of survival that turns common sense on its head. If you've ever felt the warmth coming off a sun-baked rock long after sunset, you've already felt a clue to Balint's secret. Let me know in the comments if you've experienced that phenomenon. And if you believe in the power of quiet ingenuity, take a moment to subscribe to this channel. Balint Komlos was not a carpenter, he was not a farmer, nor a frontiersman in the American sense. Back in the old world, on the great Hungarian plain, he was a Volyog-Vedo, a puddled clay razor. His trade was not in wood, but in earth. His hands were accustomed to the feel of clay, sand, and straw, not the heft of an axe or the bite of a saw. He had spent his life building the thick, monolithic earthen walls of farmhouses and the massive, heat-soaking chambers of agricultural kilns. His tools were not levels and squares, but wooden tamping blocks, shovel-like mixers, and an intimate, almost instinctual knowledge of how different soils cured under the sun. He knew how to time the layers, how to let one lift of rammed earth dry just enough to bear the weight of the next, creating a single, solid mass, that breathed with the seasons. He had come to America with his wife Ilona and their two small children, Istvan and Zsofia, seeking land and a life of their own making. They arrived in Nebraska with little more than their passage papers and the clothes on their backs. Like every other settler, they faced the immediate, brutal necessity of shelter. Their first winter on the Loup River Flat was a lesson written in ice and misery. They had managed to erect a small, standard log cabin before the snows came, chinking the gaps with moss and mud as best they could. It was not enough. That winter was a siege. The single pane of glass in their small window, a luxury they had traded a good blanket for, seemed to live a life of its own. In the relentless wind, it would bow inward, its surface visibly curving under the pressure, emitting a low, mournful hum that went on for days, a constant song of dread. Outside, the rope for their well froze solid to the iron pulley wheel, becoming an inflexible rod of ice. Getting water meant a perilous trip to the river with an axe, but the most terrifying moments happened inside, in the deceptive quiet of the cabin. The air became so intensely cold and dry that the very wood of their furniture began to surrender. One night, as they huddled near the stove, the joint of a simple pine chair, Balint's own handiwork, gave way with a sharp crack, like a green stick being snapped over a knee. It hadn't broken from weight or use, but from the cold itself, which had shrunk the wood and shattered its integrity. Ilona had gathered the children closer, her face a mask of quiet fear in the flickering firelight. In that moment, watching his family shiver in a shelter that was failing them at a molecular level, Balint Komlos made a vow: never again. He would not fight the Nebraska winter with the flimsy weapons of the frontier. He would fight it with the weight of the earth itself. The failure of that first cabin was not a failure of craftsmanship. It was a failure of physics. The conventional wisdom of the plains dictated a log structure. Cottonwood, pine, or cedar logs, squared and notched, formed a wall that was certainly better than a tent. The gaps were chinked with whatever was available: mud, moss, even cloth, to stop the wind. The problem was that this method addressed only one part of the cold: infiltration. A well-chinked cabin could be relatively free of drafts, but the wind was not the only enemy. The true, relentless killer was heat loss through the solid material of the walls themselves. A solid log wall, perhaps 8 inches thick, has an insulation value, an R value, of around R8. This is a measure of its resistance to heat flow. For comparison, a modern insulated wall is often R20 or higher, but even this number is deceptive. The real issue was not just the rate of heat loss, but the almost complete lack of heat storage. The log walls had no significant thermal mass. Think of it this way: the wood stove in the center of the cabin was a heat engine, burning precious fuel to pour British thermal units, or BTUS, into the interior air. The air would heat up quickly, creating a bubble of comfort. But the cabin itself, the logs, the floor, the roof, acted like a sieve. The moment the fire died down, the heat stored in the air would rush out through the walls, the ceiling, and every tiny unsealed crack. The temperature inside would plummet, attempting to equalize with the bitter cold outside. A frontiersman's cabin was not a thermos. It was a leaky bucket that had to be constantly refilled with heat. This reality dictated the rhythm of life for Balint's neighbors. The family of Silas Croft, whose claim bordered his own, was a perfect example. Their larger, well-built cabin consumed an astonishing amount of firewood. Croft and his sons spent a significant portion of their autumn cutting, splitting, and stacking a mountain of cottonwood and ash, a fortress of fuel that would be systematically devoured by their cast-iron stove. Their nights were a fractured, exhausting ordeal. Someone had to be awake at all hours to feed the fire. To let it go out for even an hour was to invite a dangerous, bone-deep chill into the house. Their lives were tethered to the stove. The space 2 feet around it was scorchingly hot, while the walls of the cabin were frigid, coated on the inside with a delicate, beautiful, and deadly layer of frost. The water bucket, kept a mere 10 feet from the roaring fire, would be a solid block of ice by morning. This was accepted as normal. It was the price of living on the plains. The problem, as everyone saw it, was the terrible cold outside. Balint Comlos understood the problem was the hollow heart of the house itself. It had no memory of warmth. The construction began in late July, as soon as Balint had secured the logs for his cabin's inner core. He built a small, tight structure, only about 16 by 20 feet, taking extra care to notch the logs snugly. This would not be his primary wall. It was merely the skeleton. Once the roof was on, the real work started. This was the Fexkarakas, the swallow's build, a name from his homeland that evoked the way swallows build their nests from mud, pellet by pellet. His pit was his workshop. Using a shovel, he dug out the rich, heavy clay from the banks of the Loop River, 100 yards from his site. He hauled it by wheelbarrow, dumping it into the shallow, circular pit he had excavated. Then came the prairie grass, cut with a scythe, and chopped into lengths of 6 to 12 inches. This was the binder, the reinforcement that would give the clay tensile strength, much like steel rebar in modern concrete. Finally, he added water, bucket by bucket, until the mixture was a thick, sodden mass. Then came the part his neighbors found so bizarre, the mixing. He hitched up his trousers and stepped into the pit. For hours, he would tread the mixture, a slow, circular dance. His feet and legs were the tools, feeling the consistency of the mud, ensuring the straw was evenly distributed. It was exhausting, messy work under the Nebraska sun, but Balint was methodical, patient. He was not just mixing mud. He was creating a specific, engineered material he understood intimately. When a batch was ready, a thick, uniform paste that clung together, he began to build. Using a pitchfork and his bare hands, he lifted the heavy cob onto the base of the log wall. He didn't use forms. He simply piled and packed it, tamping it down, working it into a solid, dense layer. He started with a wide base, a full 30 inches thick, creating a massive earthen footing around his cabin. This first lift was about 18 inches high, and then he stopped. To the watching eyes of his neighbors, this was just another sign of his foolishness. He had built a low mud curb around his house and then simply walked away. But this was the secret of the Valyog Veto. The clay had to cure. He needed the sun and the dry air to pull the water out of that first layer, to shrink it, harden it, and make it strong enough to bear the next. For several days, he did other chores, leaving the wall to bake. When he could press his thumb into it and leave only a shallow print, it was time for the next lift. Layer by painstaking layer, the wall grew. Each new lift was slightly less thick than the one below it, creating a gentle, inward slope, a batter. This was a feature born of ancient knowledge. It ensured the wall's stability, shedding water, and directing its own immense weight downward and inward. By the time he reached the roofline, the wall was still a formidable 14 inches thick. The total structure was a log cabin wrapped in a monolithic shell of earth that was 6 feet thick in places near the ground. It had no seams, no joints, just one continuous, sculpted mass. Asa Renfrew made it a point to ride by periodically, as if to check on the progress of a public folly. He saw the massive sloping walls nearing completion in the September light and shook his head in genuine disbelief. This time, his criticism was more than just mockery. It was a calculated economic attack. "Comlos," he said, reining in his horse. "I was just at the lumber yard in town. told them about this project of yours. Balint continued his work, smoothing the final layer with a wet wooden float. I told them, Renfrew continued, his voice sharp, that no man who builds with mud understands how to frame a proper structure. I told them that mess you're piling up will soak through with the first autumn rain. Then the ground will freeze, the frost heave will get under it, and that entire wall will crack and slump into a useless pile of mud by Christmas. It won't be worth the ground it's sitting on. He paused, letting the threat sink in. I advised them not to sell you any more sawn timber on credit. No point wasting good lumber on a man determined to build a house that will melt. It was a devastating blow. Without credit, Balint couldn't afford the milled planks for a proper floor or interior finishes. He would be left with a hard-packed dirt floor. He stopped his work and looked at Renfrew, his eyes calm. He gestured to the nearly finished wall, which was already a pale, dry tan in the sun. The clay must be dry, he said quietly. Then he turned back to his wall, his message clear. The conversation was over. Later that evening, inside the dark, half-finished shell, Ilona ran her hand over the interior log wall. Through the door, she could see the monstrous thickness of the new earthen layer. "It is a strange-looking house, Balint," she said, her voice soft. "The children of the neighbors point. But Istvan's cough is gone, and the wind does not sing in the glass." He nodded, accepting her practical assessment. The mockery lasted for a season. The validation would last for a lifetime. To understand what Balint Komlos had built, you have to stop thinking about a wall as a barrier and start thinking of it as a battery, a thermal battery. The principle he was harnessing is called thermal mass, and it is one of the most powerful and misunderstood forces in building science. All materials can store some amount of heat, but some materials are far, far better at it than others. A cubic foot of wood can store about 28 BTUs of heat for every degree Fahrenheit its temperature is raised. But a cubic foot of packed earth, like Balint's cob, can store around 35 BTUs. That seems like a small difference, but Balint wasn't using a cubic foot. He had wrapped his cabin in an estimated 2,500 cubic feet of the stuff. The total weight of his earthen shell was over 120 tons. He hadn't just built a wall, he had built a landform. Here is how it works. In a conventional log cabin, the heat from the stove primarily warms the air. Air has very low thermal mass. It can't hold much heat energy. So when you stop adding heat from the stove, the warm air quickly transfers its energy to the colder logs, and the logs transfer it to the outside world. The process is rapid, the house gets cold. In Balint's house, the physics were entirely different. The small, efficient fire he would burn for a few hours in the evening did warm the air, but that was its secondary job. Its primary job was to radiate heat energy directly into the massive earthen wall that formed the interior of his home. The heat soaked into the clay and straw, but it did so very, very slowly. This property is called thermal lag. It's the time it takes for a change in temperature on one side of a material to be felt on the other side. For a thin log wall, the thermal lag might be an hour. For Balint's 6-foot-thick wall, the thermal lag was estimated to be over 48 hours. This meant that the heat from Tuesday's fire was still slowly migrating through the wall on Thursday. The immense mass of the earth acted as a giant energy reservoir. It absorbed heat when the fire was burning, preventing the house from overheating near the stove. Then, throughout the long, cold night and into the next day, as the outside temperature plunged, the wall began to slowly, gently radiate that stored heat back into the living space. The wall itself became the heater. The problem with the Nebraska winter wasn't just its ferocity, but its duration. A cold snap could last for weeks. The frontiersmen fought this battle in hours, constantly feeding the fire to beat back the cold that was always pressing at the door. Balint Komlos refused to fight that battle. He had built a structure that operated on a different time scale. His wall was a clock, slowing down the transfer of energy so profoundly that winter would run out of night before the cold could get through. The mockery he endured was based on a misunderstanding of the enemy. His neighbors thought the enemy was the cold. Balint knew the enemy was time. That winter, the plains decided to test his theory. In early January, a high-pressure system slid down from the Arctic, locking the sandhills in a brutal, windless, cold snap. For 11 straight days, the temperature never rose, above -20 degrees Fahrenheit. At night, it plunged to a terrifying -34. The air was unnaturally still and dry, a cold so profound it seemed to have weight. It was a silent, crystalline cold that made metal brittle and wood cry out in protest. At the lumberyard, Asa Renfrew lost a dozen prime pine boards that were left exposed in the stacks. They simply cracked down the middle with sharp reports in the dead of night. For Balint's neighbors, it was a state of emergency. At Silas Croft's cabin, the battle was constant. They were burning wood at a rate that terrified them, watching their winter supply vanish. Despite a fire that made the stove glow a dull red, the far corners of their main room never warmed. The frost on the inside of their windows was an opaque, half-inch thick sheet of ice. They lived in a small circle of warmth, wrapped in every coat and blanket they owned. To venture more than a few feet from the stove was to enter a different climate zone. Their children were sick, their faces pale, their breath fogging even indoors. The water in the bucket, placed as close to the fire as was safe, was a solid block. This was survival on a knife's edge. Inside the strange, sloping mud house of Balint Komlos, a different reality prevailed. Life was normal. Balint kept a small, steady fire in his stove, using less than a third of the wood his neighbors were burning. The air inside was still, calm, and held a steady, comfortable temperature. There was no desperate huddling. Young Istvan and Zofia, in simple woolen shirts, played on the packed earth floor, which was covered by a few rag rugs. The interior log walls were not just free of frost, they were warm to the touch. The ultimate proof, the small, mundane miracle that defined Balint's victory, sat on a little ledge he had carved into the thickest part of the interior wall. Here Ilona kept her supply of tallow candles. In any other house on the plains, during this cold snap, those candles would have been frozen as hard and brittle as glass. A chandler 2 claims over had discovered his entire stock was ruined. If you knocked one candle against another, they shattered. But on Ilona's ledge, the tallow remained soft. It was pliable. You could press a finger into a candle and leave a deep, waxy dent. The tallow was still pourable soft, just shy of its melting point, a testament to the gentle, constant warmth being radiated by the wall it sat upon. While his neighbor's world was shattering from the cold, Balint's was so thoroughly protected that the very state of matter had been preserved. A cup of water spilled on the Crofts' floor would freeze in minutes. On Balint's floor, his daughter Zofia could roll a small wooden ball across the rugs, her bare hands never once growing cold. The Vindication, when it came, was not born of argument but of iron-hard physics and ruined lumber. Asa Renfrew, the timber broker, owned a small stack of perfectly seasoned premium pine boards he had set aside for a special project. Worried about the deep snow and the frozen ground, he sought a place to store them temporarily. He looked around the bleak landscape, and his eyes fell on the Komlos place. That absurdly thick mud wall, at least, would serve as a solid, dry windbreak. Dismissing the structure as anything more than a large, dumb object, he had his man haul the boards over and lean them carefully against the south-facing earthen wall of Balint's house, up off the snow. He left them there for 2 nights, during the absolute depths of the cold snap. On the 3rd morning, with the air at a soul-crushing -34 degrees, Renfrew returned to collect his precious lumber. He grabbed the end of the top board and pulled it away from the wall. A sickening crack echoed in the crystalline air. The board had split, a perfect, catastrophic fracture running its entire length. Stunned, he checked the next one. It, too, was ruined, cracked by the intense, dry cold that had leached every bit of resilience from its fibers. In a fury of disbelief, he went through the whole stack. Every single board was destroyed. He stood there, surrounded by the wreckage of his finest timber, his breath pluming in the still air. His eyes fell on the earthen wall. It was completely unmarked. There was no line of frost, no sign of the intense cold that had just shattered his wood. It looked impassive, neutral, as if the weather simply didn't apply to it. On an impulse born of pure, frustrated bewilderment, Renfrew pulled off his thick leather glove. He reached out and laid his bare palm flat against the hard-packed clay where the boards had been resting. He had braced himself for the searing, biting cold of a rock left out in such a temperature, a cold that felt like a burn and threatened to glue his skin to the surface. He expected to feel the very essence of the Arctic night. Instead, he felt nothing. Not warmth. Not the impossible heat he secretly feared might be leaking through. He felt an utter and complete absence of cold. The wall was not sucking the life from his hand. It felt like touching a stone in a cool cellar on a summer's day. It was just neutral, dry earth, entirely disconnected from the brutal reality of the air around it. The cold, he realized with a sudden gut-wrenching clarity, had never made it this far. The wall had stopped it. He stood there, hand pressed to the clay, for a full minute. He went utterly quiet. Every confident, mocking word he had ever spoken about this house turned to ash in his mouth. Balint emerged from the cabin, carrying an empty bucket. He saw Renfrew, his bare hand on the wall, and the splintered pine at his feet. He understood immediately. He said nothing, simply waiting. Renfrew finally pulled his hand back, staring at the massive, sloping structure as if seeing it for the first time. His voice, when it came, was a hoarse whisper, directed not at Balint, but at the wall itself. "You didn't build a house," he said, his mind grappling with the scale of his misjudgment. "You built a season." News on the frontier traveled as fast as a man on a good horse, but it spread even faster when it involved a story this good. The tale of the Mad Magyar's warm house and Asa Renfrew's shattered pine became a legend of the winter of '84. The mockery turned to curiosity, and curiosity to respect. The mechanism for its official spread came in the spring, in the form of a traveling salesman, a drummer, who sold clay tiles and drainage pipes for a brickyard downriver. He was a man interested in all things earthen. Hearing the stories, he made a special trip to the Comloss claim. He was not a mocker, he was a student. He walked around the house, running his hands over the hard, undulating walls. He peppered Balint with questions, not about its appearance, but about the mix, the curing time, the thickness. Balint, a man who shared knowledge as freely as he had endured ridicule, answered simply. The drummer, whose name was Harrison, made an unusual request. He asked if he could cut a small sample from the wall. Seeing the man's genuine interest, Balint agreed, pointing to a non-structural section near the base. With a hammer and a wide chisel, Harrison carefully extracted a wedge-shaped cross-section of the wall, from the interior log face to the outer surface. That sample became his greatest sales tool. As he traveled the Loup River Valley, visiting brickyards, lumber mills, and farmsteads, he brought out the wedge of earth. He didn't just tell the story, he demonstrated it. He let hardened men feel its surprising weight. see the dense matrix of straw and clay, and trace the path from the inner log to the outer skin. He would hold it and say, "The fire warms this side in the evening," pointing to the log face. "By the next night, that warmth has only made it to here," he'd say, indicating the middle. "The cold never gets through." The idea, the principle, began to spread. Few settlers had the time or patience to replicate Balint's full fexcaracas, but they adapted the core concept. Farmers began banking the cold north walls of their existing cabins with thick layers of sod and clay. The brickyard in Kearney, inspired by Harrison's sample, began producing large, unfired adobe bricks, not for building, but for homeowners to stack against their interior walls, creating a heat sink next to their stoves. By the following winter, dozens of families had implemented some variation of Balint's technique. The reported fuel savings were staggering, often between 40 and 50%. They were burning less wood and living in more comfort. Balint Komlos had not just built a house, he had changed the thermal landscape of the Nebraska frontier. What Balint Komlos did in 1884 with nothing more than river clay, prairie grass, and knowledge passed down through generations anticipated the most advanced principles of modern building science by nearly a century. He had no instruments to measure BTUs and no vocabulary for terms like thermal lag or heat capacity, but he had a perfect, intuitive grasp of the concepts. Today, architects and engineers designing high-efficiency passive houses use these same ideas. They design structures with super-insulated envelopes to stop infiltration and, crucially, they incorporate carefully calculated thermal mass. Concrete floors, stone walls, or phase-change materials to store and re-radiate energy, just as Balint's wall did. His earthen shell was a low-tech, high-mass solution that solved a problem modern building science is still grappling with today. The Loup River Flat was an unforgiving teacher. It did not reward theory, credentials, or conventional wisdom. It rewarded what worked. The American frontiersmen, with their sharp axes and efficient saws, were masters of speed. They could erect a shelter against the wind in a matter of weeks. They built for the immediate. Balint Komlos, with his slow, patient process of mixing mud and waiting for the sun, operated on a different clock. He was not building a shelter against the wind. He was building a fortress against time. He understood that the great, unspoken enemy on the plains was not the instantaneous, plunging temperature, but the relentless, grinding duration of the cold. You could not defeat a Nebraska winter with a bigger fire. You could only outlast it. He couldn't stop the cold from coming, so he built a wall so deep, so massive, that the night was simply never long enough for the frost to complete its journey from one side to the other. It was a victory not of force, but of profound, earthen patience. If you learned something new about the incredible power of thermal mass from this story, please show your support by hitting that subscribe button and liking the video. And for our community of thinkers and builders, I have a question. What is the most clever old-timer building trick you've ever heard of? Share your stories in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. This video presents historically inspired reconstructions for educational and storytelling purposes. The characters, names, and specific events depicted are fictionalized for narrative effect. However, the techniques and scientific principles are based on real historical practices. The application of any building technique today should be done in accordance with modern building codes, safety guidelines, and professional consultation. This content does not constitute professional, technical, or legal advice.